Where are we?
We're in Building 25. We're in John Lawrence's office, and I'm Sonal Pardeshi. I'm product manager for Visual Studio Team System.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So we're here to probably just talk about Visual Studio Team System?
I think we are.
Oh, cool.
And we're going to be talking about SCM and best practices, and John is the dev manager, and
oh, cool.
he's going to tell you a little bit about
So you're,
himself.
What's your name?
John Lawrence.
Yeah.
John Lawrence.
You're the dev manager. Great.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
So where are you from, John?
I'm from, as you can probably tell from my accent, from the UK. Originally from Cambridge. I was for about 10 years before moving over here.
Yeah, you have some postcards from
That's
Cambridge
right.
up there.
That's actually where he used to live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you go to college there? Or?
I did. I went to college there and then I hung around there.
Which college did you go to?
I went to Queen's College.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we had a Channel 9 video where we took people punting on the ground. So.
Punting's a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. Were you drunk
punt?
like the students that were on our video?
Yeah, a bit of both.
They were having a lot of fun. It was one of their breaks right after finals when we were there. So.
Oh, that's a crazy time in the river. You get people kind of jumping off the punts, climbing over the bridges, and then back down the other side and jumping. It's kind of fun.
Yep.
Right.
Cool.
Okay, so I wanted to start by just asking John what he does. He works on Team Foundation and wanted to know where he started off and what things he's doing now.
Cool. So I'm the development manager for Team Foundation Server. I've been on it for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, couple of years now. I initially started out managing the work item tracking components of Team Foundation. As a group, we were spread around Microsoft quite a lot. We had work item tracking in Building 28 at the time. We had the project management stuff in Building 41 at the time. That was a separate organization. Version control stuff is all developed in North Carolina. And the team build components are all developed in the India Developer Center in Hyderabad. So it was a very disparate group. And over time, we've learned from our organizational kind of difficulties and brought everyone together into one single organization. So the Redmond folks are all in the same building here in Building 25, and I now kind of oversee development of the whole Team Foundation project, although we do have kind of managers in each of those offices as well, in North Carolina and India.
Wonderful. Diversity is great. So can you tell us a little bit about SCM and what your thoughts are on that, whether you think of that as source code management or whether you think of it as software configuration management?
Yeah, it means different things to different people. Outside, the SCM might often mean software configuration management, so it could be to do with not just source code control, but managing your build lab, your infrastructure for tracking bugs, making releases, that kind of thing. But other people just mean it to mean source code management, so how on earth am I actually managing where my source code lives, my branches, how do I release software from that, how do I build software from that. So there's a blur between both of those things. Right. For me as a development manager, what I think about is the whole process from getting code in, where does the code live, how does it get built, how do developers work on bugs, checking fixes for bugs, how do I keep quality of the code high all the time so that there's always a good quality build I can give to our test team to pick up and build, and then how do we trace and track regressions, and how do we make releases from that in a way that we can stabilize a release whilst enabling developers to continue developing for future milestones or future products at the same time.
Right, and is that how you do SCM with Team Foundation, is where you actually break down all the barriers between the different areas? Yeah,
I mean, Team Foundation, the goal that we have at Team Foundation is really to try and bring all of those components together and in a way that I think is probably more integrated than anything else that's out there. There are a ton of products out there to help with SCM, doing version control, for doing defect tracking, for doing daily builds and that kind of thing, for running unit tests, but none of them really give you the level of integration that we have within Team Foundation.
And how many people do you think you actually have on the team that are using Team Foundation, and, you know, for example, approximately how many files do you think you manage?
Right, so I went and checked my blog today, because I post some statistics up there of how many files and how many users and how many workspaces we have out there. So one of the metrics that I have is how many workspaces people have got open against our source code repository. And what that basically means is how many different machines are looking at our source code at any one point in time.
Right.
Currently we have nearly, I think, about 1,000 workspaces. So they may actually be on, you may have several workspaces on a machine if you've got a developer working on different branches in the source
Right.
code. But that's basically, that's how many enlistments we've got in our repository, so something like 1,000 of those. I think we've got something like 500 distinct people with work items and things like that associated with them at the moment as well.
Amazing.
Now, Windows Vista is not built using your tool yet, right?
Not yet, although actually the internal tool that we use for managing bugs at Microsoft is a tool called Product Studio. And the work item tracking components of Team Foundation are based on that. So actually the team that works for me on work item tracking is originally the team that started working on the work item tracking for Windows.
So you learned a lot from having thousands of developers building Windows.
Exactly, yeah. So that's not true of the version control stuff, but definitely the work item tracking, the bug management stuff. It's not just learning. There's actually some shared code with the same server components that we use for the bugs in Windows. Hardly any of them, but I mean, really, I mean the working in the Windows organization is a huge test for us. It's a huge proving ground, and I still have developers on my team who continue to support the Windows organization and some of their specific needs for the bug tracking system that they use.
Yeah, that's sort of my test. If it's good enough for the Windows team, that probably means it's good enough for most other software development projects.
And they have some pretty aggressive goals, and I'm not sure that they're going to be our next big customer for Team Foundation. Really, Team Foundation was targeted at kind of enterprise development shops where I think our sweet spot was kind of like 50 to 500 developers was where we were aiming.
And there's thousands working on Windows.
Absolutely, thousands working on Windows. So we haven't kind of reached the scalability levels that they are wanting us to reach yet, but we definitely, I think, exceeded our original goals of 50 to 500 developers. And we're
when you said they, you mean Windows.
I mean Windows, yeah. But we're really actively working with other groups now. As we're kind of wrapping up V1, we're working with a lot of other external groups to try and get more and more people using our stuff rather than the old internal products that we've had for a while.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Product Studio. Were there any other tools that were developed within Microsoft that you're learning from and using within Team Foundation, for example? What was the source control system you used before you started doing TF?
So I'd definitely say we have learned a lot from the different source control solutions we've had at Microsoft, and most of Microsoft doesn't use Team Foundation yet for version control. We use an internal tool which we call Source Depot. But we've learned a lot from that, and in fact, in the Team Foundation organization, the developers who maintain Source Depot also are part of the same organization. So they keep Microsoft running on a daily basis, keeping that old system up and running. And we're learning from them all of the time. So it's the same team working on all of those bits.
All right. And can you tell us a little bit about the applications and how you actually begin with them, how you structure them, how you actually plan the entire development process?
So how you would plan development process for a project using Team Foundation?
Right.
So Team Foundation kind of builds on top of Visual Studio very much. Team Foundation introduces kind of like a higher level concept of a team project. So if you're used to working with Visual Studio today, you create solutions and projects for your code and for your application. But there's nothing that really helps you manage something bigger than that, because a lot of projects have got more than one exe or more than one deliverable, or have got multiple teams and multiple locations. You need to bring those all together. And that's where we introduced the concept of a team project. And when you're using Team Foundation to do that, you'd create a brand new team project using our project creation wizard. And that's not just kind of creating a solution for a specific project type. Instead, what that does is create your source code repository for you, sets up your database for you, initializes your work item types that you're going to use, and out of the box, we support a couple of different software development methodologies that we've developed internally, MSF Agile and MSF for CMMI process improvement. And in that, you also kind of get your SharePoint portal is set up when you create your new project, which has got all of your own documentation about what's the team process that we use for defining new features or checking in bugs, and it defines what roles everybody has. And we've also got third parties who are working on methodologies to extend Team Foundation as well. So things like Scrum maybe, or extreme programming, maybe even, I don't know if there may even be a RUP methodology that folks are developing for it.
And our users would like to know what sort of methodologies you actually use yourself within your teams. Is it more Scrum based? Is it a custom methodology?
Do you know, I mean, it's kind of, that's a great question to ask, because we at Microsoft, I've seen all sorts of different methodologies used, and different teams are developing their own methodologies and refining existing ones all of the time. We are kind of in a transition time, because we're part of DevDiv, and DevDiv and Visual Studio have got a process that has been defined over a long period of time. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the ideal one, but we kind of have to fit within that process. As we're looking to where we're going with V Next, I know that some of the team system teams are really looking at things like MSF Agile and saying, well, how can we use that to improve our processes? So I think we'll see more of that now that we're done, and as we're kind of looking at what we could do better with our next version. But certainly within Team Foundation, we've tried to use our built-in work item types for things that are out of the typical bug tracking scenarios, but because we still are part of the wider organization, our bug form that we have for what's, you know, the information that we store with every bug is hugely complex. It has way more on it than you have in an MSF Agile bug form, simply because it's inherited from the DevDiv bug form. And actually that's actually quite an interesting point for an SCM best practices point of view, which is what we're talking about. What we've had in the past and what Windows has had and other organizations with our Product Studio product is you have a single work item type for your organization. So Windows has a single work item type, DevDiv has a single work item type, and you use that in your database to track pretty much everything. Bugs, design issues, suggestions, feature requests, tracking issues, and each one of those work item types has different data that you want to have with it. So for a bug, you want to know the steps to reproduce the bug. For a task, a test task, that could be completely different. You might want to say, well, how does it fit into our testing infrastructure? And so what ends up happening is if you have just one work item type, this grows and grows, and you end up with way more information than you need on every single bug form, and it becomes very hard to actually manage and see what's going on. So what we've done with Team Foundation is change the concept from what we've been doing internally to try and encourage people to develop different work item types. So you'd have a bug form, and that contains the information specific that you need for a bug, and then we make it easy to create new work item types to manage different types of operations that you want to track within your project.
And people can extend that, and they can actually create their own different types if they want it.
That's right, yeah. Okay. So we've done that over the time when we've been working. We've kind of taken some of the MSF Agile ones that we have out of the box, and we've used those. And then there have been other ones that we've been using to track other things and things like that. So.
Can you also tell us a little bit about what sort of extensions you've done with the system, or what sort of systems you integrate with, so that our users will know how easy it is, or whether it's even possible? Right.
So yeah, Team Foundation has been built on top of Team Foundation, if you like. It's a very extensible system. So our work item tracking client that we have in the Visual Studio IDE and the add-ins that we have for Excel and Project, they're all written on top of our APIs, which are available for third parties to extend and use. So we already have some third parties that are working and building into Team Foundation. So Borland are working on integration with Team Foundation for their Calibre RM requirements management system, so they're extending it that way. So you've got that kind of level of large product integration. But then one of the other really cool things about Team Foundation is how developers can kind of write little things that plug in and build on top of it. So we're having people who are building widgets to monitor work item tracking data and things like that and pop it up on the screens. We actually had one of the guys downstairs from one of the other team system groups hooked up when they were in one of their drives to get to 0 bugs for shipping Visual Studio 2005. He hooked up a big LED display and put it in the corridor, which showed the results of certain queries on the bug counts as they were trying to get down to 0. So every 15 minutes it would kind of integrate with our system and put all the current data up on a big screen.
Everybody into
Absolutely,
doing their job.
yeah, and they hit their goals. So, I mean, that's the level of stuff. But we also integrate with some of the processes that we have as well. So one of the things that we have in Team Foundation is the ability to have check-in policies applied. So when I check in a piece of code, I can say as a development manager, I want to make sure that it's meeting certain quality goals and certain process steps before somebody checks in code. Because one of the key things that I have to ensure is the quality of our daily builds. That really is a key to successful development, I believe, is making sure that there is a build on a daily basis which builds cleanly, which our test team can install, and the functionality works. And that's really a guiding principle that we generally have here. So that means that I have to make sure that every check-in that goes in is a high-quality check-in and doesn't break the build on a daily basis. We don't go through a cycle of throwing code in and then waiting for weeks and then trying to get the builds out. It's very much trying to make sure that every build every day is a good build. Now, we don't always succeed. Frequently, there are problems that you can't predict, but that's our goal. So what we have is a system called Gauntlet, which actually evolved prior to Team Foundation, but we've plugged Team Foundation into it. And so instead of a developer checking in code directly into the branch, which we generate builds from, we have a server which we call Gauntlet, and a developer uses Team Foundation to create a shelf set of their changes. We can talk about shelf sets later on, but these are the changes that they want to check in. And instead of submitting it directly, they have to submit it to our Gauntlet server. And our Gauntlet server then takes that code, ports that shelf set onto its build machine. It then does a build in a clean environment, and then when the build succeeds, it deploys the bits onto some test machines, a whole kind of little farm of test machines, runs through a bunch of tests, and if they pass successfully, then it will check in that shelf set into the Team Foundation version control on behalf of that user. So we make sure that every piece of code that gets checked in has been synchronized with all the it's been synchronized with all of the latest components and actually builds and runs correctly.
Okay, that's a wonderful example of extension. Can you also tell me a little bit about the policies that you were talking about? What sort of custom policies do you use, or if you can tell me even difference between if somebody really wants to talk to
sorry
you.
about that.
That's all right. What sort of policies do you have for development versus release?
Right, so that's a great question. Maybe I can show you a demo of the way that we would apply some of the policies. So let's see if my machine comes up here. So this is Team Foundation within the Visual Studio IDE. Hopefully you can see that okay. And I've got a team project here in Team Explorer. And here we can see nodes for managing work items, our SharePoint portal that goes with the projects, reports, team builds, these are our daily builds, and our source code control, and that will bring up our source code control Explorer here. Now, one of the things that I want to do as a development manager is make sure that the code that gets checked in meets the policies that I lay down. And one of the things that I really like to do is make sure that every code change that goes in is traceable. And to do this, I want to know why a developer has made a code change, because it's amazing how many times down the road, in months' time, there's a change gone in, and you realize it's caused a problem, but you've got no idea why the developer actually made those changes. So I require that developers have a bug or a work item that's associated with every check-in that they made.
Right.
And we enforce this with Team Foundation, and this is a policy that you get out of the box.
And that's some sort of linking that you can do between files and work items.
So I'll show you how it works. So so here I can go into my team project settings. Hopefully this will. So this is my local build with most recent bits. So if it misbehaves, then that's my excuse. So here I get the ability to apply check-in policies, and I can add one here. Here I'm going to add a work item check-in policy. So I click on that, and basically all this does is say that every check-in requires a work item to be associated with it. So I've now applied that to my team projects, and now everybody who's going against my team foundation server are required to adhere to that policy for my team. So I can now go in and I don't even know if I've got this solution open, so I'm going to open up a test project that we have here. Make a change to a file. So and attempt to check this in. In fact, here I've got a little pending changes window that I get with Team Foundation, which shows me the changes that I've got, and I can go and look at the differences between the latest version that's checked in or the version that's on my machine. And here I've got a bunch of different channels. Down here, this is policy warning, so I can see here that my check-in policy hasn't been satisfied. So if I attempt to check this in right now, it won't let me do it. It'll say that there's a policy violation. I can actually choose to override that policy, and because there are going to be emergency situations sometimes when things don't work out. But that's traced in the check-in. You can tell that somebody overrode the policy and slap them around later on if that's necessary.
When you talk about traceability, is there some way, like a form or something, where you can go and say, I want to see everything associated with this work item or with this particular file?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's show something here. So what I can do is
and the tracing. Have you started spitting out RSS feeds or emails or
so
you as a manager would get warned? Hey, somebody just broke.
So
broke rank.
I knew you were going to ask me about RSS. So
that's my job.
RSS wasn't in the original product, and we don't have it. But one of my devs in North Carolina has written a sample RSS feed for source code control. So I actually have in NewsGator a subscription to all of the check-ins that are made in the system. So I get an RSS feed for all of that. And I've adapted his code to generate RSS feeds for work items as well. So it can have an RSS feed for specific bugs. So if somebody changes a bug, I can have an RSS feed for work items that are assigned to a particular person, or when the results of a particular query for work items change, I've got an RSS feed associated with that. I haven't published that yet. It'll be up as a sample, or I'll put it on my blog, but that's what we're working on at the moment. So.
Very cool.
So yeah.
All right.
Good. Pass the Scobel RSS test. So what I was going to get to show you some of this traceability. So this is for my check-in, for my little change here. I can, from my pending changes window, show the result of a query on work items. Here I'm just looking at my work items, and I can associate it with a bug that I've just created here. And here I can actually have an action when I associated it. So when I check in, I can actually, if this code is to fix a bug, I can have it automatically transition that bug from the active state to the resolved state for me. So I don't even have to remember that as a developer. All I do is check in my code, say, this is the bug that I'm working on, and boom, everything is done for me.
That easy, huh?
Yeah, and then in here I can also associate notes. And I can actually apply check-in policies to require some of these fields to be filled in as well. So the same way that I did a check-in policy for work items, I can require that somebody fills in this code reviewer field, because that's actually another thing that I use internally. Every code change that goes in has to have had a code review from at least one other person on the team. So I enforce this. If people try and do a check-in and they haven't filled in the code reviewer field, then that's going to get rejected. So I can type in, that Rob Scobel was my code reviewer. And here, now that I've associated with a work item, it's told me that all my check-in policies have been satisfied. So I click check-in, away it goes, and checks in that piece of code, hopefully. So now I've made that change. I'm the developer as far as I'm done. If I'm the development manager and I want to see what folks have been doing, I can also go and look at these bugs. So I can go to my Team Explorer or my source code control explorer, bring up that file, and I can view the history of that file. And I didn't actually add a comment with the change, which was very remiss of me, but one of the things that I can do is just bring up that change set, double click on it, and any point in time I can go and see everything that was associated with that change set. So it doesn't matter who I am, on which machine I am, I can go back and look at not just the differences between file revision A and file revision B, but I can look at all the metadata that was associated with that change set, including, going and looking at the work item as well.
Yeah.
So this is work item 17. Now similarly, let's say I'm a tester or I'm a program manager and I want to find out, well, what code changes went in to fix that bug. So I can do it the other way as well. So I can look at work items, all queries. Let's just look at resolved bugs. I'm a tester. I want to see which bugs have been resolved that I want to go and double check that the developer's actually done a good job. So here's the bug that we resolved, and if I move down to this bottom tab here, I can see in my history that it was resolved with a particular change set, and I can even get down here and look at all the details as to see, well, who resolved it. It was resolved by me, John Law, and then in the links I can actually see it's linked to the source code control changes. So if I double click on that, up I get the work item, the source code control check-in details as well. So I have this end-to-end traceability with the whole system.
That's really cool.
But then the really cool thing, this is like one of my favorite features. Every time I run this, I'm hoping it's going to work. So I'm going to create a team build. So this is a nightly build. So what I want to do is make sure that on a nightly basis I can build all of my team's code. So in my team project I can have lots of solutions, so I'm going to pick this one. I've only got one in this case. It's going to build the release flavor of the build. I'm going to put it on my my development box here, build it in that directory, and put it, when the build is complete, put it in a public share that other people can then pick up on a nightly basis.
So you could do remote builds and you could control
That's
it
right.
from
So
right
this
here.
could be on another machine.
Right.
And the team builds are all shown in my team Explorer and are shared to everybody. So depending on who's got permission, I can either schedule them, or anyone can go and kick off an ad hoc build, or you can do it. Our team in India has just set up a rolling build system for us, so that basically all this machine does is does a build, gets the latest bits, does a build. When that's complete, does the whole thing again. So I have this rolling process that can pick up and detect changes and problems as soon as is possible. Another thing I can do with builds is when they complete, actually execute unit tests or test cases as soon as the build is done. So here I've got some tests that are already defined as part of my project, and I can also perform code analysis as well. So I can make sure that it not just compiles and passes the test, but code analysis can check for security vulnerabilities, potential bugs, buffer overruns, that kind of thing, and it will go and analyze your code and require that
And
that
it's
happens.
just automated, and you can take a look at the build report or the
That's
logs.
right. So here I'm finishing off my build. So I've gone through the wizard. Hopefully we've got time for this, and I'm now going to actually build the team project. So I'm going to kick that off right now, and that might be on a different machine. This might be something that for us happens overnight and is a big thing for Whidbey. A Whidbey build takes a very long time to go through. For this team project, it's kicking it off and it's starting to go. So I get a build report for each build, and here we're actually watching the build in progress now. Currently it's compiling the code, which is the first step. It's pulled down all of the latest sources from the version control stuff. It's now running through all of the build tests. Now it's actually getting to a point where it's running the tests, and it's successfully completed all the tests as well. So in my build, I can see here, and anyone who's connected to my team server can go in and see all of the build results. So somebody from QA can go in and find out that the build is finished. But it's not just that the build is finished. So I can see, as a development manager, that there were no, whether there were any warnings or any errors in my compilation steps. But similarly, I can also look at the result details. There's no errors, no warnings, no test result, no coverage results. So that might be a concern to me. But here I also get, because it's all integrated, I know exactly which check-ins have been made between my previous build and my current build. So I can, as a dev manager, see what changes have been made. So I can actually go in here and you can see everything. This is my first one, so I actually created the team project in it. And you can see all of the check-ins that were made. Similarly, I know which work items have been resolved since the previous build. So I can actually, as anyone on the team project can go in, look at that build, and see all of the work items, all the bugs that were fixed in that build, and all the check-ins that were made at any point. So we've got this complete end-to-end story, which it just blows my mind.
Interesting.
Great.
It's an amazing demo. Yeah,
Well,
thank you.
this
John.
is really cool for
Yeah.
development teams. I'm starting to think, how could you get users and marketing people involved in the build process? Because I notice when I'm...
Do you want marketing people in the build
Yeah,
process?
I think you do, because you want marketing people to be learning about your code and writing marketing materials as you're adding features, right? And you want... This is the traditional problem, right? The marketing team
dangerous
doesn't talk to the dev team doesn't talk to the marketing team.
So it's an interesting... it's an interesting idea. One of the things that we try and do in some of our methodologies that we ship with Team Foundation is introduce the concepts of scenarios and user scenarios. So in other words, kind of little mini features that when they're done, and each scenario is going to have a number of work items that are associated with it. Yeah. When those work items are complete, then the scenario is done. And what we provide out of the box, and it's not working on my machine right now, are a number of reports which enable you to see how am I doing against those scenarios? What's my progress?
Right.
Here are the work items that I need. What's my progress in actually finishing all of those scenarios off?
Right. So it brings a lot of visibility
Yeah.
For the entire team.
And one of the things that we've been introducing the concept of recently are just measuring things by those scenarios and having what we call an OGF, an overall goodness factor, for each one of those scenarios. So we have a scenario which is one kind of component of the product. It might be generating a build, or it might be something like just checking a file in, so a small enough feature. Or it might be something that's actually slightly bigger. But the idea is we have an OGF that our test team will say, actually, because of these bugs that I've got here, my OGF, my overall goodness factor for that scenario isn't good enough yet. Yeah. And I provide reports out of the box so that people who are in management and marketing can actually go in. Anyone who's got access to the system can go and review our reports portal and see how we're doing, how well we're getting along close to our goal of being able to ship.
Yeah.
See which bits are solid, which bits are slightly...
Is there any way during the process of building to have it create a web page for the entire company to... here's where I'm going is we do a lot of dog fooding. Like this morning I got a dog food request from the office team. And I'm not even on the office team, but they said, hey, we have a build ready for you.
Yeah, great.
Right? And is there any way in here to say, hey, invite these people to this build? The build tonight is going to be the one for the whole company, or this one is only for developers to test out, or stuff like that.
Right.
It's almost like it'd be interesting for the tool to build like a blog almost that sort of put out a report.
So all the builds are available from our build reports, either from kind of this window, or we build on top of SQL Server reporting services, and we have a whole bunch of reports. Some of them enable you to, so you don't need any client installed on your machine. You can go and just browse to that report portal and see, and you can drill through from, this is a day's build, drill through and see which bugs were in there and see what the build was, how the build was categorized. But every build, I can actually categorize a build as well. So I can actually, when I look at my list of all of my builds, I can actually mark it with a certain status. So I can see here what my build quality. So after my QA team has gone in, reviewed the changes that are part of that build, they can actually mark it with a quality. And that's all accessible externally to anyone, and they can look at the how QA have rated that build, and when it gets passed as a certain level, we have varying different categorizations we use internally for a build being suitable for test to pick up or being suitable for you to actually host and start using on your machine. Right. You mark that, and then people know which builds they can pick up. Right. And because as part of Team Foundation we create a portal for your project on top of SharePoint, you can go, and that portal has build reports, links to all of the reports from the homepage for your team project.
So there's SharePoint integration?
Yeah. So this
cool.
Node here...
Because they're adding a lot of this stuff on that side.
So this node here, when you create your team project as part of your methodology, it's more than just creating a repository. You create a whole SharePoint portal. And the repository can... so I can open the project portal, which is going to open my SharePoint site.
You could probably have a web part that shows you the OGF factor.
Yeah,
for
so
every
we have
project.
because we build on top of reporting services. This isn't actually the reports aren't working on my machine right now, so
Yeah.
this isn't the final thing. But here you can see it's pulling up on my home page for my project my remaining work report. So
Yeah.
it's actually going to tell me the status. And I can obviously it's SharePoint. I can choose which reports to see, and I've got links here to bug rates, builds,
Oh, that's great.
quality indicators, and all
The
of that
next
stuff.
SharePoint
is
has
there.
RSS too, so I
Yeah.
can subscribe to that page. And
Exactly,
when
yeah.
you guys say, "Hey, the build's good enough,"
Yeah,
you know.
exactly, exactly. So all of that stuff is there. And it's
That's
possible.
really neat.
That's great.
The other thing, when I was working for a small developer, we had a README file, right? That sort of every time we added a cool feature, we'd put it in the hey, check this out. Or
Mhm.
anytime we knew we fixed a bug or changed something, that the user would have to be.
That-
Is there like a README file?
Well, that's
kind of?
really our idea behind this build results, creating these associated change sets and associated work items. Is what you're doing is effectively creating your information about what was changed in that release. And I'm not sure if we ever got around to doing this. I'd have to check out whether or not we actually create a text file with that information in that you can then put on your disk. But certainly the whole thing is entirely extensible. So the build process, I can add different tasks in there. It builds on top of the MS Build stuff that ships with WIDBE.
you can
So it's
have-
actually a very extensible
Can you have
process.
some kind of a custom action that says that I want to run these tests and check this before I go ahead and build the next set of.
That's right. You can,
Code.
and there's events as well that I can subscribe to. So when a build completes or when a check-in occurs, I can write code that gets executed and does whatever I want it to do. And all of those APIs are available for other people to build on top of.
Alright.
Does this product work as well for centralized kinds of development? Here at Microsoft, we're very decentralized, right?
Mhm.
Every developer has their own office, and they really don't have talking ability. Where, like, I was visiting Plaxo, and their whole dev team is in one big room around a desk, where they can really communicate rapidly, using voice. Does this fit that kind of scenario?
I don't see any reason why it wouldn't fit that scenario. I guess that some of the things that we do here are necessitated by the fact that we're in different offices. So some of the communication that we do through check-ins and through email, you'd be doing through voice. So maybe they'd have to introduce a little bit more discipline about recording some of the face-to-face conversations that they'd have. But honestly, I think that the transactions that developers make are in checking in code. Those face-to-face communications can help make some rapid decisions and sort out issues, but ultimately the currency that we use are code check-ins, and as long as you're putting the information in your code check-in, then it's in there and it's traceable.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, going back to a little bit about source code management, and some of our users had questions about VSS and how you can share, and why that's not available in Team Foundation, and what the alternative might be.
So yeah, working with VSS. VSS, by the way, we do provide tools to enable you to upgrade your VSS database. Well, not upgrade, but migrate your VSS database into Team Foundation. So if you want to make that move, you can do.
Sure.
But one of the concepts that VSS has that we don't have in Team Foundation is sharing. And in my mind, one of the real reasons why we've not introduced sharing is because sharing, I think, can work well on a small team project where everybody knows exactly what is going on. But one of the principles that I mentioned earlier on that I try and have is that I know that the build is always good, and I want to make sure that every check-in that I make doesn't break the build. That's just, I believe, is something that we really try and adhere to, and it just keeps the quality actually at a bare minimum. It doesn't enforce the fact that the code works, but the build is not broken. I consider that a bare minimum, and sharing introduces a bit of a problem with that, because the idea of sharing in VSS, as I understand it, is that you have one source code file in one part of your tree, and you decide, actually, I've got another component in a completely different part of my project, which also uses that header file or whatever. So I share it. It's in two places. If I make a modification in one place, it gets changed in the other place. But one of the downsides about that is, as a developer, I'm working in one area and I know that I've got to change that file. I don't necessarily realize that by changing that, I'm also impacting other code that's got dependencies on that file someplace else.
Right.
And so I do my bit, I check in my code, it builds, I check it in, and it's great. But then the next day the build is broken because that same file has been shared somewhere else, and I didn't realize it, and I didn't know what was going on.
Right. So that's one of the best practices.
Yeah. So really, I think it comes down to a best practice about how you architect your software.
Right.
It's kind of, that's a shortcut, I would say, into ways of sharing code, but it's much safer to find other ways of sharing your code. Either kind of saying this is an independent. If there really are two independent projects, then make it independent code, or find a base place which both components can inherit from or call into or locate that file from. So share the code properly. Don't use that as a kind of sidetrack. Actually reuse the component.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about branching and how you actually merge back and propagate changes through your code?
Yeah. So branching that's a huge topic. We could spend hours on talking about how different teams use
Maybe how you
branching.
Do it. Okay.
So one of the things that I could talk about is how we've been doing branching with the Whidbey project and how the division.
What is branching, first of all? Just
Branching. So one of the things that you find when you're doing development is it becomes, you think it's linear. It starts off linear. You make code change A and then code change B, and then at the end of the day you've got a product and you're done. In practice, life is not that seamless, and you end up often having milestones or having to, because we want to maintain the consistency of the build that the QA team is picking up every day, but the development team has suddenly realized we've got to rewrite a whole area of work, and that could create some problems for those daily bits, and we actually want to go away and experiment and then come back and put those changes back into the rest of the code. So you create a branch of your code. So you're kind of creating a fork in the road. So you end up with your mainline branch that might be built on a daily basis. Then we create a branch, so it's another version of that file. So they've got a common initial point. We've branched it into two versions, and they're going away and being developed in parallel. And sometimes that's it. They just get developed as completely separate branches, and the job is done. And the kind of circumstances that is useful in, and we do use it in here, is when you're actually making a release. So some teams might, some organizations I've seen, they basically say, right, this was the build that we shipped out. We'd label a build at a particular point, and this was the source code. So if I need to go back and rebuild that build, I know when it was. But the disadvantage of that is it's very hard to service that build. And it's amazing how often you think, okay, I really want to go and fix that bug because the customer's got a critical issue, but I can't fix it because the code has changed so much since then. And you find companies do things like they go and check out those bits, and then they make some special standalone machine with this special bespoke version, and it becomes very difficult to manage safely. So what branching does is instead of that point, the point where you think, right, I'm ready to start making releases, what we tend to do is we create a release branch that we will use to actually ship our software from. So we did this with Whidbey. We have a main branch for Visual Studio, and then we created an RTM branch, release to manufacturing branch, which we then used to drive all of our fixes in. So all of the teams across the whole organization checked in their fixes to this specific branch. Now this has been kept clean just for the processes of releasing, and other development work can continue in other branches. But if we ever need to service this branch, we've actually created a sub-servicing branch underneath the Whidbey build so that we can continue to develop the Whidbey code base if there are servicing issues that need to be addressed.
And is this how you usually work throughout Microsoft? So is this what the Office team does, and can you compare and contrast, for example, what DevDiv does versus what they do?
We use the concept of branching very heavily across all of Microsoft. I think pretty much every organization creates source code branches here and there. And when the thing I didn't finish saying before is the alternative is when you create a branch to do a release from, is you can actually merge a branch back into its parent branch. And that's a very important part of the process, because we might have a bunch of different development teams working on some code. When they're done, we want to push that code back up into the main branch that we're creating.
We call
all of
that
our builds
reverse
from.
integration here.
Reverse integration, that's right. So I call that RI.
Yeah.
And RI is when
We have a
push that.
build team
yeah.
video. They talked about how
Yeah.
Windows Vista is built, and they talk exactly about it.
So an RI is when I push the code that my developers have been working on into the main branch.
Right.
Similarly, other teams have been doing the same thing. So I need to do a forward integration, an FI, to bring code changes that they've done into the branch that my development team is working in. And this, depending on how you do it, can be an extremely destabilizing process for the development teams, and I seem to have spent an awful lot of my time over the last year dealing with issues surrounding with integration. I know I'm not the only dev manager in Visual Studio who felt the same things. Now, you asked about the differences between the way we've been doing it in Visual Studio and the way that Office does it. Now, I may be getting this wrong because I'm basing this on conversations we've been having with dev managers internally, but my understanding is that Office has a concept that they call feature crews. So they have a single real main branch and then each feature team, which is a smallish team, creates their own kind of very short-lived, small, scoped-down branch for doing their work in it. And then when they're done with their feature and it meets a set of quality gates, then they will reverse integrate that back into the main branch that will then get built on a daily basis. The way that we've worked in DevDiv has been slightly different to that, because we still have a main branch, but we've actually had the concept of lots of breaking that up into what we call VBLs, Virtual Build Labs, and we have a handful of big VBLs which different groups live in. So the CLR team kind of live in one VBL environment, and Team System, we've been in another VBL, and VS Core have been in another VBL. And the idea has been that these teams have been very much siloed, working on disconnected components. And we started out with those, and each one of those VBLs, they create their own daily builds. So rather than the QA team picking up the build from their mainline build, they pick them up from these virtual build labs. And each one of those virtual build labs, all of the teams have their own private branches below those labs.
Very neat.
That they then work in. They then reverse integrate into the team's virtual build labs, and then when that stuff is stable, periodically we'd push that up into the mainline branch, and then when that stuff is building okay, we'd push that down into the other branches. So you've got this code movement of large quantities of code up and down around these branches. And because that is such large changes over relatively long time scales, that's why the changes can be quite destabilizing, especially if you imagine that my team's writing code that uses certain components in Visual Studio or the .NET Framework. When those change, suddenly we get this big influx of changes to Visual Studio and to the .NET Framework, and suddenly things don't work the way that we expected them, and we have to kind of spin around and fix them rapidly. And the idea of the Office plan is that because everybody's much closer to the same point, and we're doing more frequent integrations, then we can minimize the delta between builds and somehow make that process a lot easier to work with and be a bit more agile.
Well, that's a great insight into how things work at Microsoft. Some of our customers also ask us often how they can actually do promotion modeling and how that works with TF. And if you have any thoughts on that.
So when you mean promotion modeling, you mean promoting code up from being in a developer's branch up to
the release branch.
So the stuff that I've just been talked about is all supported within Team Foundation. So you can create within the Source Code Control Explorer. I can right-click on a folder and say create branch, and that'll create a branch at a point. And then I can choose to merge that code back into its parent branch. And that's really how we would do promotion modeling.
How do you actually set permissions on these branches?
So permissions is pretty straightforward. It's kind of role-based security. So Team Foundation has, I can create users and groups to administer all of Team Foundation. It's pretty much you just right-click on a folder. You can see the security and permissions associated with that folder, and allocate groups or individual users the permission to do branches, labels, check-in, check-out, all that kind of thing. So that's all very well supported in Team Foundation. I can show you if you want, but it's pretty straightforward.
Great. Some of the other questions we've been having, and this has been coming in floods since we announced TFS Beta 3, what are the new features that people can expect to see, or what are the changes since Beta 2?
So One of the big things that I've been seeing on the news groups and the forums over the last week has been our installation experience. Team Foundation builds on an awful lot of different components, a lot of which have also been changing underneath us. So we build on SharePoint, on SQL Server 2005, obviously on .NET Framework 2.0 and Visual Studio. So there's a lot of moving parts, and installation has been difficult because there's just so many dependencies. One of the great things we did at install time is added a new thing we called Fifi, which is find it, fix it. So,
Okay.
So what Fifi does is when you start installation, it analyzes your system and all of the prereqs that we have to tell you whether SharePoint's been configured correctly.
Right.
And we found that the users were having so many issues with SharePoint configuration, not having the right firewall ports open and things like that. So that's a big help to customers who are upgrading. I will say that we've changed the way that SharePoint needs to be administered in Beta 3. So if you set up your SharePoint in Beta 2, you may have to tweak that in order to get Beta 3. So read the manual. So that's installing is a lot more painless. But backups, we talked about that. One of the difficulties that people had in configuring Beta 2 is we used ADAM for a lot of our account administration, and that proved to be very problematic for a variety of reasons. Getting the configuration right was a real problem for customers, but another problem is that it was on a different place from where the rest of our data was, so it made backing up of the whole Team Foundation database difficult because you had the database, you had ADAM, and also our file attachments that you store in work items were actually stored on a file share rather than in the work item database itself. So backing up was difficult because you had all these different bits that you needed to do, whereas now everything's in the database. It's all transactional, so it means that you can make use of all of the standard SQL backup mechanisms that are available, so that's good. There are a ton of good things. Just performance is good, it's just a lot more reliable. A great feature that I blogged about last night is our Excel integration with work items is much slicker now.
I've got to see that.
So, do you want to see it? I can show you. So, let's find it.
Because that's something a lot of our users do and they ask about.
Right.
Is how you actually, and I've seen it in Beta 2 and it works pretty great there as well.
So one of the things that I have done a lot as a dev lead and as dev manager is, I want to see what work items I've got on my team, and I use Excel a lot to kind of just see progress and type things in and draft those out very, very quickly. So one of the cool things that we have in Team Foundation is I can look at all work items, and I can just right-click on that and open those work items in Microsoft Excel. And it's going to open up Excel, and I'll be able to see all the work items there. I can then edit those work items in Excel, change them, update them, create new ones, and then basically publish those back to my server. So I don't have to be a developer to work with the work items in Team Foundation. I don't need to have Visual Studio installed on my machine. I can be a program manager looking at a list of items, defining my feature. Here are all my feature requests that I need. You can enter them all in Excel and push them into the database. And I can add and remove columns and things like that. So that's pretty powerful. Now, one of the really cool changes that we made from Beta 2 to Beta 3 is that in Beta 2, when I imported a list of work items, what it remembered was the work items themselves. So if I refreshed it, it refreshed the state of those work items, which is the right thing to do for some of the situations. So I've got a list of work items in the feature that I'm interested in. I want to watch to see when those are all done. But as a dev manager, one of the things that I often want to do is where are all the open bugs that need to be fixed before we can ship? So I actually want to bind it to a query rather than work items. So now this particular list is actually associated with the results of a query rather than the specific work items. So if I'm a developer or a tester, I go in here, I create a new bug. Oh no, that code is crashing.
Save the query so that every time you go into Excel, you can pick a query and.
That's right.
Instead of having to go to the dialog box and choose.
That's right. So here I've just added a new bug. I'm in Excel here. I can just refresh this now, so it's now going to run the same query again, which is all, in this case, all work items.
Right.
And you can see here it's pulled over that new work item.
Nice.
And I can edit that work item here, and publish it, and it'll then appear back for the developer in the Visual Studio environment. And I can choose queries from Excel directly. I don't need to have done what I did, which was open it from the IDE. I can actually click on it, get a list of the queries that are available, and pull those work items over as well.
Well,
That's really cool stuff.
Yeah, it is. I'm glad we came over here
Yeah.
and talked to John today. I want to thank him for spending time with us and
You're
telling
welcome.
us about all these great features and about his processes and his thoughts on SCM.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is a great product.
Thanks.